Richard Nixon is not just the only American president to resign. He went to his grave never knowing of the prosecutor's secret allegations that destroyed his presidency. This is Watergate Revisited, an insider's view. I'm Jeff Shepard, and I'm your instructor in a course entitled Watergate Revisited, an insider's view. And what we're going to do, this is our 8th week of a 12-week course, looking behind the scenes, not the public understanding of Watergate, but what was going on behind the scenes in the White House and behind the scenes in the Special Prosecutor's Office. As always, we have a disclaimer slide, and today is focused on Nixon's dramatic demise. And we're going to talk about what was going on that triggered that and how that came to be. Just a quick reminder of how we got here. We started with, at the week one, with 3 surprising revelations: that the prosecutors and the judges were meeting in secret, that John Dean, the principal accuser, never spent a night in jail, even though we were told he was sentenced to 1 to 4 years in prison, and that, my view, after all is said and done, Richard Nixon was driven from office by the secret allegations by the prosecutor that he had personally approved the payment of blackmail. And we'll see how that filters out. The second week, we talked about the 3 critical time periods that we were going to study in detail. The events surrounding the break-in itself, the events surrounding the collapse of the cover-up when people scurried for immunity and their stories changed, and the events today that led up and culminated in Nixon's resignation. We covered the first set, the break-in, in week 3. We covered the collapse of the cover-up in week 4. And then we took a couple detours. We did one on rearming the staff because we had total turnover on both sides, and we lost the institutional memory of what had happened, and the prosecution became politicized, and that's dangerous for a prosecution. We talked in the next week about the 2-pronged attack by the prosecutors to get Nixon. And we'd used Jaworski's phrase, "at all cost." And we talked about how they wanted to indict him, and when they got frustrated, then they wanted to impeach him. And as we move on, we're going to learn they went back to trying to indict him. And then we took a detour last week about the plumbers. And the plumbers seems like it's totally disconnected because it happened before the break-in. But it involved exactly the same people, and it involved national security, and that was the major reason John Dean used for not disclosing anything, that the minute you start to disclose, it's going to lead back to the plumbers break-in, and there's going to be a disaster. So we dealt with those, and now we're gonna do Nixon's dramatic week, and then having set it all up, Week 10 is the allure of the White House tapes, when we thought they would answer all the questions. Week 11 is judicial and prosecutorial abuse. Next week, which I skipped, is the cover-up trial itself. Nixon resigns, his top aides are tried in a 3-month cover-up trial. Then we're going to go back through and talk about the tapes and talk about prosecutorial abuse. And then week 12, I know you're holding your breath, week 12, this admonition against current events stops, and we get to talk about today, not this day, which is an interesting day, but what comparing Trump to Nixon. But until then, this is a history course. We're talking about how things occurred, and these are the 2 weeks culminating in Nixon's dramatic demise. The Supreme Court rules on the tapes case, U.S. v. Nixon. That's July 24th. It was unexpected. It just 10 o'clock, they announced their opinion. The Judiciary Committee of the House recommends its first of 3 articles of impeachment 3 days later. But when the court ruled, nothing happened in the public. It's just the court ruled. Then the House acts without knowing what's behind those tapes. Then, about 8 or 9 days later, on August 5th, we released the smoking gun transcript. And then the Congress comes down to visit the GOP leadership on Tuesday the 6th. Nixon announces his intent to resign on the evening of Thursday the 8th. He says goodbye to his staff in the morning, gets on the helicopter, and the resignation takes effect at noon. We're going to go through each one of these, but this is the dramatic week. Someone asked, did the atmosphere change inside the White House? Let me tell you, the atmosphere changed inside the White House during these 2 weeks. Okay, let's go back over the Supreme Court's decision in the tapes case, because it gets there in a very funny way. The grand jury issued a subpoena for 9 tapes under Archibald Cox in July 23rd of 1973. Judge Sirica upheld that subpoena. It's a grand jury subpoena. The D.C. Circuit upheld the subpoena on October 12th. And following the Saturday Night Massacre, the White House turned over those 9 tapes. Now, we announced we would turn them over on October 10th, but we needed to transcribe them, to finish the work on them. So they didn't really get to Sirica until late November, and they didn't get to the special prosecutor until early December, because Sirica had to listen and decide what was protected by executive privilege. Then you take 6 months off. That's why there's a blank in this one, because time passes, and then almost out of nowhere, the special prosecutor on his own asks for 64 more tapes. This is not a grand jury subpoena. The grand jury has already indicted people for the cover-up. When the prosecutor says, well, we've been thinking about it, and we want 64 more tapes. Sirica upholds. No surprise there. And then Jaworski pulls a fast one. He says, we're not going to the D.C. Circuit. We're not going on appeal. I'm going directly to the Supreme Court. Now, since Jaworski won on Sirica upholding the subpoena, you might ask yourself, how could he do that? He didn't lose. How can he appeal? Well, what was odd about Sirica's rulings on the tapes, he doesn't say they have to be turned over to the grand jury or they have to be turned over to the special prosecutor. He says they got to be turned over to me, moi, and I will listen to the tapes and decide what's covered by executive privilege and what's covered by the need for a criminal investigation. So Jaworski's people grabbed onto that and said, he's got no right to hear these tapes. We want them, and goes to the Supreme Court. And to many people's surprise, the Supreme Court granted certiorari. So they took it, skipping the D.C. Circuit, and we went about briefing a Supreme Court case. Go back to the staff rearming, no interference. Go back to the staff rearming. When we were first fighting to protect the tapes, when they were first revealed, we had the input and assistance from Charles Allen Wright, a very prominent professor from the University of Texas. He had written this very, very important book called Wright on Federal Courts. And so he was a national expert, and he was our lead defender on the tapes. He left after the Saturday Night Massacre, and I think I pointed out to you for 6 months, or maybe it's 4 months, we had nobody able to speak publicly until Jim St. Clair arrived on January 4th of 1974. Well, St. Clair's overwhelmed because he's fighting to protect Nixon in front of the House Judiciary Committee that wants to impeach him, and he's fighting to do the case, present the case properly in front of the Supreme Court. And he has about 12 lawyers, and they're getting overwhelmed. So Mac Howard, who is one of his deputies, Mac later went on to become a federal judge on the D.C. District Court, neat guy. He says to St. Clair, why don't we go touch base with Charles Allen Wright? None of us chatted with him. None of us were here when he was originally doing the defense. Why don't we see if he can give us some help? And St. Clair said, well, you know, we got this under control. We're here. We're on site. He's been gone. And Max said, let me give him a call. So it turns out that Al Wright is on vacation someplace. They trace him down. The White House operators can find you. You can run, but you cannot hide. They get him. And he comes up with a really interesting idea. Nobody knows about this. You're hearing this for the first time, okay? He says, look, the grand jury asked for 9 tapes. Jaworski indicted everybody. Now Jaworski's coming back on his own, no grand jury, asking for 64 more tapes. I submit to you, he is asking for those tapes on behalf of the House Judiciary Committee that can't get them directly because of separation of powers. You know, our Constitution has 3 branches and the branches can't cross-examine each other. So this is Charles Allen Wright's late arriving idea. And the brief is all done and due, so they just change one sentence in the introduction. That's the only place you can find this idea. It's never developed in the back of the brief. Idea came in too late. They go argue the case. I told you I was the official representative. I got to sit behind the screen. They argue the case. Some people say it sounded like Jaworski had a strong case going in on the steps of the Supreme Court, but when they got inside, it was all St. Clair. Because St. Clair's this really good, I mean, Jaworski was good too, but St. Clair is this really Harvard-trained trial lawyer. But if you don't get to watch Supreme Court arguments on TV, but the court very seldom lets the lawyer presenting his part get through more than 3 sentences before they start questioning. So St. Clair never really gets the chance to develop this interesting article, okay? And it goes away. And you just ask yourself, gee, I wonder if that was true. I wonder if the 64 tapes were really when, because we know now, the special prosecutor's office was staffing the House. Remember, I told you, I read you memos about how they were meeting with the staff in secret. John Doerr came down. They prepared the prosecutorial memo to share with Doerr in secret so the White House wouldn't know this was going on. And I showed you that prosecutorial memo only presented one side. We had that wonderful concluding paragraph. To be fair, you got to say the other side, and it's not there. I mean, it's, you know, fair's fair. Okay, so that's what happens. And then the Supreme Court announces their decision, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, on July 26th. It was a surprise. They don't tell you when an opinion's coming down. And it was 8-zip. You got to turn the tapes over to Sirica. Rehnquist recused himself, so it's 8-0. And the president and Jim St. Clair and the immediate entourage are out in San Clemente. And Buzhardt and I are back in the old EOB, in the White House compound. And Buzhardt gets a phone call from Al Haig, and Haig says, there's this tape. You should probably go listen to this tape. So Buzhardt goes and listens, and it is the tape we later called the smoking gun. It's the tape of June 23rd, where the president agrees that the way to keep the FBI from investigating 2 people is to get the CIA to tell the FBI, stay away from these 2 people. And so for the first time, Buzhardt goes and hears the tape. Okay? Then he comes back, and he's supposed to report to the San Clemente folks, to Al Haig, but Nixon's going to be on the call, what he thinks about this tape. And Buzhardt gets scared because this is unexpected. This is confirmation that Nixon's been in on the cover-up since day 6. And he decides not only he's got to tell Al the game is up, but he needs a witness. That's what he said when he learned. And who does he choose for his witness? Me. Okay? So I'm called down, and I'll tell you about it. It's the next slide. Buzhardt is not an outgoing guy. He's a secret keeper. He's a conniver in the back rooms of politics. He's got this office in the old EOB that was built for the Secretary of State. A huge office. Desk is, back there. And he's got no chair by the desk or in front of the desk. Normally you've got your desk, 2 chairs, sit down, tell me about your troubles. He didn't want anybody sitting down, interfering with his work. So if you're going to sit, you're at a sofa back here. And he would call me in, he would give me an assignment, I would go, but no chit-chat. This is just what we're doing. And I told you, no memos. Never. It's all oral. He calls me down and he starts chit-chatting. Okay? And we'll get to it on the next slide. But his bottom line is the president has the last clear chance to resign over the issue of Oval Office secrecy. And we call that on the slide principled resignation. And he's pitching it to the guys out west. And Jim St. Clair is out west. And Nixon writes in his biography that St. Clair has this breezy optimism, his phrase, that this tape can be handled. Don't worry about it. And I think I told you, Nixon had been chatting with St. Clair about becoming Attorney General. St. Clair's arguing in front of the House. He's argued in front of the Supreme Court. He didn't want this to stop, and he's confident, he can pull this off. He doesn't listen to the tapes. Only Buzhardt has heard the tape. So St. Clair wins the argument. 9 hours after the Supreme Court rules, St. Clair goes out on the lawn, West Coast time, and says, of course we'll comply with the Supreme Court decision. No man is above the law. We'll turn the tapes over. What's the next question? And back at where we are, Buzhardt has concluded the presidency can't be saved, and you see the bottom line there, we start transition preparations. So Len Clodney has a book, Ray Locker has a book coming out in May 1st called Haig's Coup. Ray says Haig was going to flush Nixon from the day he was appointed. But there's no question from July 26th. Yes, July 26th, 1974, the staff was interested in preparing for a transition. Okay. Now let's go to what Buzhardt said. And this is a 45-minute conversation. Nobody's ever heard this before. There's no record. There's no tape machine in Buzhardt's office. So I call it Buzhardt's soliloquy. And I'm going to go down, and he compliments me on the effort. We've come a long way. I appreciate all your help. I'm here to help. And he says, before accepting this job, I made a list of all the allegations, and I reviewed them with Nixon. And I said, was that the list we made up when St. Clair and his staff were hired? Remember I gave you that typed list of about 15 things? He says, yeah, that's roughly the list I reviewed with the president. And I told him, this is Buzhardt, I told him if 2 or 3 of these things turned out to be true, he was going to have to resign. And I said, well, what's the count? He said, 10 or 11. So he said, and he starts describing his background in Washington. And I think I told you a little of this. Fred Buzhardt's dad was Strom Thurmond's first law partner. And Strom came after graduating from law school, and he went to West Point, and was Strom Thurmond's legislative assistant. That's the chief of staff name back a ways. And when Strom Thurmond gave that very, very famous filibuster on the Senate floor where he talked for 26 hours or something, he got one staffer, and the one staffer was Fred Buzhardt. So you've got, Strom Thurmond may have flipped and become a Republican, but he's core South. And Fred is, as a staff assistant, is core South. And what Fred explained was he had dual roles here at the White House. As long as he could tell the Southern bloc, most of them were Democrats, that there was nothing on the tapes that was unambiguous. about Nixon and criminality, the South would stick with him. But he had to be able to assure them that there was nothing on the tapes. And he says, I've just heard this tape, I can no longer provide that assurance. Now, remember, my view is he's misunderstood the tape, but he doesn't know it, and I don't know it, and he's describing it. So he says, when we got the subpoena for the 64 more tapes, Nixon divided the list into 3 groups. There was a pile he should listen to, a pile Buzhardt should listen to, and a pile they didn't have to worry about because it didn't involve Watergate. And I thought, if nobody's heard that pile. And Buzhardt surprised me because he said, I always worried about the pile Nixon wanted to listen to, that he wouldn't let me even hear. So he goes off and he says, in electing officials, politics isn't clean. You know that today. The system is not designed to elect angels. This is a dangerous world. The president has to make tough decisions. But I've come across this thing on the tapes that should never become public. What I heard, the public shouldn't ever hear because it will ruin their view of Nixon and maybe the presidency. So I'm down on number 7, okay? He says he's going to have to resign in any event. This is his last clear chance to resign over a principle that I call principled resignation. And this is his scenario. We had never said we would follow the decision of the Supreme Court. So all along, as it's getting litigated and argued, the talking heads are saying there's going to be a constitutional crisis and Nixon will disobey the finding of the court. But we've never said we would follow it. What he thought the president should do would be to say, look, the court has ruled. The court has its prerogatives, and it says I must turn these conversations, these secret confidential conversations, over to the special prosecutor. I disagree. I have powers independent of the special prosecutor. I have the power to pardon. It is absolutely unfettered, and I have pardoned everybody involved in Watergate. That moots the case and any rationale for a special prosecutor, so I have destroyed the tapes. I think destroying the tapes and protecting Oval Office confidentiality outweighs prosecuting my friends. And I know the price I must pay for this, and that's I resign. Okay? That was Fred's idea. You're going to have to at least go over principle. So I said, he lays it all out for me. I'm 27, 28 years old. And I said he'd never do it without the promise of a pardon. And Fred says, I happen to have a draft right here in my pocket. Oh, been there before me. So then the phone rings. And see, he's placed the call to San Clemente. He's waiting for Al Haig and Nixon to call back. Phone rings, secretary comes in and says it's Al Haig and President Nixon on the line. And he starts out, I remember the first words, because I can only hear half the conversation. I'm over here on the sofa. He says, it's pretty much all there, Al. There's no ambiguity at all. And then he starts fencing with, what about the alternative approach? Silence. Well, it's really the last clear chance, Al. You understand what's on that tape. And if we go out and say we're going to release the tape, we're going to release the tape. There isn't going to be any fooling around. There isn't going to be any gap that we didn't know about. I mean, he really says this. And he hangs up. He says, okay, that's the decision. Hangs up the phone. He's furious. He says, it's St. Clair. If they were back here, I could win this argument. But they're out there in the sunshine. And St. Clair goes out on the lawn and says, we'll do what we want. And then I get Buzhardt's instructions. And he says, okay, prepare the transcripts. There's 64 tapes. Now, some of them we released when the White House disgorged some transcripts, but not all. He says, transcribe this tape first. Go work, his secretary's name was Tony. Go work with Tony and get this one done, and then do the other tapes that we haven't done. But take your time. I don't want you working 14-hour days because I want to be able to tell the court we haven't finished. So 8 hours is all you get on transcribing these tapes because I have lots of work to do and I have people to see. And what he meant, clear as a bell, I got to go up, see the Southerners on the Hill, and when they say, how do things stand, I got to tell them things look pretty bleak. So from that day, behind the scenes, Nixon's lawyer, and then St. Clair 2 days later, they turn on the president. And they say, this isn't going to work, and we better get ready for a transition. And I don't have it on here, but Buzhardt arranges for St. Clair to go chat with Jerry Ford, who's vice president, and warn him he needs to make preparations. And somehow the topic of a pardon comes up, but there's no resolution. So later, Ford can testify, and he does, to the Congress there was no discussion of a pardon. But the idea was planted. Okay. The House, 3 days after this, but there's no known disclosure, the House votes its first of 3 articles of impeachment. The first one's obstruction of justice. It's approved 27-11. Second one, and these occur 3 days later, abuse of power, that's 28-10, and then defiance of subpoenas. So it's obstruction of justice, which is the Watergate case, abuse of power, which is everything else. He's not behaving like we think he should behave as president. And the third is he's refused to turn over the transcripts, the tapes. We asked for the tapes, and he gave us transcripts. So those are the 3, okay? Now, we always go back to Harvard because that's how we test the objectivity of the committees. And I've listed the Democratic members, 4 of them. On the Democratic side of House Judiciary, there's 3 Republicans, 3 Harvard graduates on the Republican side, and then there's the staff, and there's, 6 or 7. I highlighted Bernie Nussbaum, who later becomes Clinton's first counsel to the president. He's in charge of the Watergate issue for the House. And then William Weld, a year after me at Harvard, you may remember the name because he recently announced he was going to run for president. He was governor of Massachusetts, going to run for president as a Republican. Little trouble because he endorsed Clinton and Obama, but Massachusetts is a different kind of state. But the fact of the matter is, unlike everything else, the House Judiciary Committee is run by Yaleys. Okay, it's not run by Harvard. There aren't enough Harvard people here. I didn't look up the Yaleys because it just doesn't matter to me. But it's very clear they were in charge. And that includes not only Burke Marshall, who's teaching at Yale but running it, and Hillary Rodham, a brand new graduate, JD from Yale of 1973. So she's barely a year out of law school, but she's helping to run this too. So let's go to what happened with the House. They launched their own impeachment. The committee launched its own inquiry right after the Saturday Night Massacre, but the full House authorized it after developments early in 1974. They hire a unified staff. So John Doerr is technically chief counsel, and Albert Jenner is technically supposed to represent the Republicans, but he's really Doerr's deputy. And then they get 45 lawyers. Now, the Judiciary Committee in the House is one of the largest, one of the most contentious because of the abortion issue, and it's got about 45 members. So what they did was have everybody got to put a lawyer on the committee, and then they did nothing. And there's some inside work about this. I had no involvement in this, but they had them cutting out newspaper clippings about Watergate and compiling notebooks to just take up time. The staff began having secret meetings with the prosecutors in May. Doerr had his own series of secret meetings starting on July 1st. That's when they're showing him the prosecutive memo. Late at night, he's making copious notes. I maintain the founders of our fine nation never envisioned for a group in the executive branch to staff the House on impeachment. But that's what's going on. The prosecution staff has all this grand jury information. They can't use it against Nixon because they can't indict him, so they're moving it up to the Hill in secret. Now, this isn't being fought about out in public. This is in secret. They recommend 3 articles of impeachment, and then they seal their internal records till 2024. So all the Shepard's allegations, and I suspect everybody, all of Shepard's allegations can't be checked because the record's been sealed for 50 years. And I hope I'm alive in 5 more years. Okay? So there's a couple of books that have been written about the House Judiciary Committee's evaluations. The first one is Renata Adler's review. It's yellow in the picture and white in my possession. She's a very liberal columnist and journalist, very, very capable. And she was editor of The New Yorker. And you remember, she did an article saying why she wouldn't review Sirica's book, and then there's a whole chapter in here about how bad Sirica was. That's at the end of the book, but the start of the book, bunch of essays. Start of the book talks about her experience, and she says there's no real case for impeachment, and the entire process was its own cover-up. And I have 2 great quotes. And remember, I'm finding liberal people to say these things. They're doing a reunion of Doer's staff. After 2 years, it was no longer clear what the resignation had meant, or even what the inquiry had to do with it. Meanwhile, with every document published by the Church Committee, we'll get back to that in a second, that's revealing for the first time all the government's intrusions into the lives of Americans, and all this stuff the FBI did for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. And it's starting to roll out from the Church Committee hearings. It was becoming more clear that the case for the impeachment of Richard Nixon had fallen apart. Article 1 was essentially an obstruction of justice. 2 charged misuse of the agencies. 3, in effect, charged contempt of Congress in doctoring and refusing to produce the tapes. In view of the Church Committee's account of the conduct, this is in red, the conduct of previous administrations, including violations of law and abuses of power since at least 1936, the first 2 articles seem to dissolve. As for Article 3, there'd been disagreement about it from the start. Doer himself ultimately did not support it on grounds requiring the president to produce the evidence and thereby implicate himself in what would obviously be a serious criminal case, was reminiscent of the Star Chamber. Okay, she's become hugely disillusioned. Now, after Nixon resigned, Renata went back to Yale for her law degree. She's not a lawyer when she's helping to staff the committee. And then the quote goes on, in any case, it didn't matter. Article 3 would never have passed or even existed without Articles 1 and 2. The problem with all 3 articles, and with their accompanying summary of information and findings report, and with the 30-odd volume of statements of information, which were also published by the House, is that in spite of a valid perception the whole country shared of the integrity of the process at that time, all those volumes never quite made their case, or any case. And one result, which nobody on the staff could possibly have foreseen, was that in light of the Church Committee report and other documents, what remains of the records of the impeachment inquiry would support not only a claim that Richard Nixon was hounded from office after all, but also, more strangely, the reverse, that the impeachment inquiry itself was just another phase in the continuation of the cover-up of government wrongdoing, which had existed all the way along. And these folks, I'm inventing a little bit, these folks knew it. They knew what the government had done, and they only blamed Nixon. And if you really want to get into this, the most fun part of the Church Committee hearings is the testimony of Courtney Evans, who's liaison to the Kennedy administration, and Cartha Deek DeLoach, who's liaison to the Johnson administration. And they talk about bugging Martin Luther King, and Johnson's worried in 1964 that Mississippi is sending 2 delegations to the convention, the Freedom Delegation and the other, so he has the FBI bug the Freedom Delegation. I mean, they're running against Goldwater, so they want some dirt on Barry and his staff. They ask the FBI to produce dirt on these people so they can leak it. Just example after example after example of huge government abuse of the FBI and prosecutorial information. So that's Renata. Then we go down to the bottom to Jerry Ziefman. Jerry Ziefman was chief counsel of the House Judiciary, but he was not chief counsel of the impeachment inquiry. So he's Rodino's staff guy on everything except the impeachment inquiry. He hates Richard Nixon. He thinks Richard Nixon should have been indicted upon election. Some people feel that today. Indicted upon election. And he writes this book, and the book comes out in 1996, Without Honor, The Impeachment of President Nixon and the Crimes of Camelot. And he goes through and he builds this case. I think he's barely alive if he's alive today. And he goes through, I mean, he's old. I'm not making fun of him at all. He builds this case that what was really going on was that the Kennedy people who wanted to come back into government with Ted Kennedy didn't want Nixon replaced or impeached. They wanted him to limp into the election in 1976 so the Republican Party would still be in huge disrepute. And they had this guy, Burke Marshall, who's a professor at Yale, who used to be head of the Civil Rights Division, and John Doerr was deputy. And Burke is sending instructions from Yale through about 6 people who are his favorites, including Hillary Rodham, signaling John Doerr what to do. And that's why they were cutting out newspaper articles instead of doing anything, because they're trying to slow it down. Burke Marshall is expected to be Ted Kennedy's attorney general when Ted gets back into place. And Ziefman writes about all this, which I found very intriguing. And then he says, let me tell you what Hillary Rodham did. He says, 1, she was assigned the responsibility for analyzing whether in the impeachment consideration by the House Judiciary Committee, whether the president deserved legal representation. Now you could say, well, why not? Why is that so strange? And there's this analogy. In the grand jury, you don't get legal representation. You go out and talk to your lawyer, but the lawyer can't be there. And the House is acting along the same lines as a grand jury, deciding whether the president should be impeached. The trial will occur in the Senate. Well, he can have a lawyer in the Senate, but Hillary concludes he can't have no representation in the House. And Ziefman says, there were precedents all over the place. She just missed them. She deliberately missed them to try to deny Nixon representation. Now, he got it, except when they went into executive session. Jim St. Clair got to appear and present arguments, but he didn't get to hear or refute what they were told in private. Okay, that's where this secret allegation comes in. The other thing that she did, the Republicans on the committee kept saying, how do we know about abuse of power? How do we compare that with other presidents? What were other presidents accused of back through history by the Congress of abusing power? And she orchestrated a study, and the study was by the chairman of Yale's history department, a guy named Professor C. Van Woodward. And when she saw the study wasn't helpful. Lots of presidents have been accused of abuse of power, so she buried the study. Okay? And in the book, he tells this story about Charlie Wiggins, Nixon's last defender, a congressman from California, who kept screaming for comparability and examples. And Wiggins, after Nixon's gone, is walking through the airport, and on the bookshelf, there's this book. And the book, I have it in mustard, and we have it here in white. You see how you can't trust Amazon either. Responses of the presidents to charges of misconduct, including accusations of high crimes and misdemeanors, from George Washington to Lyndon Johnson. An authoritative history requested by counsel John Doerr for the impeachment inquiry staff investigating charges against Richard M. Nixon. Okay? And Ziefman says she buried this because it showed there were all kinds of arguments between the Congress and the executive on abuse of power. These are hard to come up with, but I got one. So it's not a picture. I have the book. So he says he fired her, Hillary Rodham. He couldn't have fired her. That's where we say, oh no, Ziefman doesn't know, because he wasn't her boss. So what must have happened, my view, is after the impeachment inquiry was over, they got 45 people with nothing to do, some of whom got jobs on the reduced staff of the House Judiciary Committee itself. Ziefman's in charge of that. He declined to hire her. Closest you can come. She goes off to Arkansas to marry that other Yale graduate, Bill Clinton. It recently surfaced within the last year or two that she flunked the D.C. bar before she left. It was kind of going away. It's hard to flunk the D.C. bar. This is not a difficult bar. So she must have taken it on a lark, without prep, but she flunked it. Okay. We go from there. So there's disrespect for the House Judiciary Committee, but their records are sealed. We can't research. So we go from there to the day, this is August 5th, when we released the smoking gun transcript. Okay, we've jumped ahead 7 days. There's a senior staff briefing at 3 o'clock. I'll tell you more about that. There's a meeting in the old EOB of everybody. I'll tell you about that. There's a presidential statement released. And then the media starts to figure it out at about 8 o'clock, what's in the smoking gun. Okay? So I may have to come back to this. But this is the description of the senior staff briefing from the two cub reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, from their second book called The Final Days. Shortly after 9:15 a.m., Dean Burge, Bill Timmons, Pat Buchanan, some guy named Lichtenstein, Ken Clausen, Dick Moore, gathered in Birch's office to be briefed by Buchanan. He described the weekend at Camp David. Ray Price, Jim St. Clair, and he stuck off in one cabin, Nixon in another, Haig and Ziegler running back and forth with messages. The president's saying the transcript didn't mean what it said. Remember, we'll get to it. But he's saying, no, that's what the words are, but that wasn't the meaning of the transcript. Don't believe what you hear. Where am I? And the president's senior aides conducting their own investigation of the president to confirm he listened to that tape. The tape didn't come as a surprise to Nixon. Buchanan was rubbing his hands, rocking back and forth in his chair, trying to articulate what he felt after almost 10 years of service to Nixon. He brooded about how hard he and the others had worked in the defense, how he had persistently maintained the old man was a victim, not without his faults, but still a victim. Buchanan seemed on the verge of boiling over again. The old man had lied to him and everybody else. He had connived. The president had listened to the tape 3 months earlier in May. He'd known since then. It confirmed the worst suspicions. He canceled the proposed compromise with Jaworski because that tape was included. The family, Julie in particular, were pressuring the president not to resign, but Buchanan was clear in his own mind. It was over, he said. Here's the key paragraph. This is why we show you this. He called down to the legal offices for a copy of the transcript. Jeff Shepard, name misspelled. Jeff Shepard, then he went off to the Xerox machine. This is it, he told Ann Morgan, Gergen's assistant. They found the smoking gun. He took the copy up to Birch's office and read it aloud. Okay? I'm in the book. This is all half nonsense. This is Woodward making dramatic text. Yes, I took the transcript over. Pat was against resignation. He wasn't in favor of resignation. I don't know what the group was saying, but I tell you it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was not 9:15 in the morning. So I was sent over. Fred said, go read them, the important part of the transcript. And it's the part where Bob says, so you agree we ought to get the CIA, tell the FBI not to interview these two people? And Nixon says, yes. It's very clear tape. So I finish reading it, and they're sitting around. And Bill Timmons says, that's it? That's the smoking gun? That's why Nixon's going to have to resign? Because he agreed to tell the CIA not to interview two people? I said, yeah, this is big stuff. So I went back to Buzhardt's office, and I said, they don't get it. I read it to them. And he said, wait till the media gets a hold of it, Jeff. They'll get it then. So this is one place where I really influenced the course of events. I said to Haig and Buzhardt, everybody's going to resign the minute this gets released, everybody on the staff, because they've been staying here believing the president was not involved. And when we take that away from them, they can't defend staying. And even though we think Ford's going to be president within a week, won't be any staff. So when we went back here, the EOB staff meeting is my advocacy. And I wrote Al Haig's talking points. We get everybody up in this theater that holds 200 people. And Al says, you've stayed, it's been a long jury, we've all been loyal, but we're going to release something later, and you're going to be disappointed. But don't evidence your disappointment by resigning. You have to stay for the good of the nation. No questions. Thank you. See you guys around. And I'm walking up the aisle, going back to my office, and I'm thinking, these poor folks, they have no idea what's coming. Because Al couldn't tell them what was coming. So then at 6 o'clock, we release the statement, and it's a very strange statement. The transcript's there too. But in the statement, which was drafted by the lawyers, he is made to go over and over the fact he didn't tell us. Because Buzhardt and St. Clair are far more interested at this point in protecting their own reputation and not getting disbarred for hiding this hugely explosive tape. And so we release the transcript, and nothing happens, for a couple of hours. And then Buzhardt told me later this was stupid, so he made a couple calls to point out where they ought to be looking. And then it started, and it started coming out at 8, but by 10 o'clock, they're in full rampage over the smoking gun. So we've talked about Woodward's, and now we're going to talk about the congressional visit. We release on Monday, and then on Tuesday, down comes the GOP leadership to say, Dick, and Ken was legislative assistant to Hugh Scott for 19 years, so he's heavily involved in this part, even though I won't let him talk. And I got the picture, and it's Hugh Scott, the minority leader in the Senate, Barry Goldwater, the grand old man of the Republican Party, and Johnny Rhodes on the right of Arizona, who is the minority, the head of the Republicans in the House. And they've gone in to meet with Nixon, and now they're coming out to talk to the press. And they're basically saying we delivered the message that he didn't have much in the way of support. Once that transcript came out, even Charlie Wiggins threw up his hands. There was no support whatsoever after that transcript. And what they really said, Ken can probably help me here, was, if you don't get out, we're going to be creamed in November. And you may think you want to fight on, but you're just going to ruin the party. So you got to go. And when we do the stuff out in Yorba Linda, and we have President talking on film about why he resigned, and I'm not a quitter, I've never been a quitter, I fight on. But it's really because he was going to take the Republican Party down with him. So he resigns. Okay? The next slide shows you that day. This is now the 8th going through the 9th. And we start over on the left. The meeting in the old EOB with congressional leadership, where he tells them he's going to pull out. He speaks to the nation that night, the address from the Oval Office. I shall resign the presidency tomorrow. The next morning, he says goodbye to his staff, and this is in the East Room with his family. And I'm furious. How dare he make his family join him on the stage and after all he's put them through? How can this man do that? Turns out the family demanded it. There was never any doubt in the family's view of Nixon's non-involvement. They wanted to be there, but wasn't my view. I was keying off Buzhardt. Buzhardt said, this is the smoking gun. I told you, I'm the one that named it. I'm the one that transcribed it. I know it very well. Okay, and then he gets on the helicopter. We move from the East Room out to the South Lawn, and he goes and he's walked down the red carpet with Jerry Ford and Betty Ford. And he gets on the helicopter, and he just can't stand it, and he gives his final victory. And then at the top is his resignation letter. It turns out, as a legal matter, you address the letter to the Secretary of State. It says, I shall take, my resignation takes effect at noon tomorrow. They think he was over Wichita. He takes off in Air Force One. Halfway across, it ceases to be Air Force One. And we go back in to the East Room to see Ford sworn in as president. A dramatic day. Okay, well, what about Ford? Well, 1 month later, Ford pardons him. Okay. Oh, I missed something. Down here at the bottom, didn't go back. No, I didn't put it there. That's why. Here's Nixon's resignation. Down at the bottom, it says the prosecutor's unanimous response was indict him. We wanted to indict him in the first place. We couldn't because he was president, so we wanted to impeach him. Now he's not president. And there's 15 memos in Jaworski's file. He finally says to the staff, look, if you got a view, put it in writing. Not one single person said leave him alone. So he asks his deputy to write the other side. And the deputy says, I have been asked to submit the other side. And it's a very brief memo of deciding resignation was enough. They wanted this guy. They wanted him bad. So Ford pardons him. Remember we raised the idea. Ford becomes convinced Nixon's going to die. Okay? That if he doesn't pardon him, Nixon's sick, he's demoralized, the family's scared, Ford pardons. It's generally believed that action cost Ford any ability to be elected in his own right, that his standing with the American public never recovered. And what was the prosecutor's response down at the bottom? Challenge the pardon in court. Okay? And there's a memo. It's one of the most embarrassing memos you ever hope to read. Because this memo says we can go into court and challenge Ford's pardon. Here's the theory. When Elliot Richardson was up for confirmation as Attorney General, way back, he agreed to a set of guidelines. I reproduced them. You didn't read them. But I reproduced the guidelines, gave him total independence, gave Archie Cox total independence. And the memo says we can presume that that was cleared by the president when Richardson agreed to it. It's not force of law. It's imposed by the Senate Judiciary Committee as a condition of Elliot Richardson being confirmed. Elliot's happy to sell out the president, no difficulty at all. So those guidelines then become DOJ regulations. Ford, the subsequent president, steps into Nixon's shoes. Just as Nixon was prevented by the guidelines from interfering with our investigation, so too is Ford. So Ford has no power, in spite of what you may have read in the Constitution, no power to pardon Nixon. And Jaworski says, the top memo, I would be embarrassed to even raise this argument in court, but they're so eager to get Nixon. They think a regulation agreed to, hammered out with a Senate Judiciary Committee, has precedence over the president's constitutional right to pardon. It gives you an idea of the intensity of the feelings. Okay? Now, we're going to summarize a little bit. There's plenty of blame to go around. Nixon's gone. Okay? In the inner circle, Dante's Inferno is the 9th circle. I put 3 people. Gordon Liddy, who did the Watergate break-in. He messed up the plumber's break-in. He messed up laundering the money. John Dean is the guy who ran the cover-up and then switched sides. As someone said, first he sold out his nation and then he sold out his friends. And Bud Krogh. Bud Krogh was my immediate boss. Bud Krogh's the head plumber. But remember, Bud hired Gordon Liddy. And Bud is the one who first raised the idea that John Dean might be a great replacement for John Ehrlichman. So he's institutor of bringing the 2 others in, and I put him in the center. And we get to the standard of guilt in a criminal case. This is the next bullet. In tort law, as you know from my previous lectures, a tort is a civil wrong not involving a contract. It's not criminal. You pay money if you're found to have been civilly liable to somebody else. And the standard most used in a particular sort of tort case is they knew or should have known. Remember my first example was we're breaking the fire code if we let more people in. And so we could say to you, you knew or should have known when that person walked in, that violated the fire code. Okay? If that's the standard, the White House failed. That's not the standard for taking away somebody's liberty. Taking away somebody's liberty is doubt of criminal activity beyond is convinced they committed criminal acts beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a much higher standard. And we know from Blackstone, if you ever have anybody going to law school, you buy them Blackstone's dictionary. He very famously said, better 100 guilty go free than we convict 1 innocent man. It's a very, very high standard to take away people's liberty and put them away. Nixon, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman, and perhaps Mitchell, there's acres of reasonable doubt, my view. We'll get to that. We have a whole next week on the trial. But the founder of Temple gives this very famous speech. I know you've had to memorize it, called Acres of Diamonds. It's a fun speech to read. Well, I tell you, there's acres of doubt about the Watergate trial. And then we get the unfaithful lawyers. Nixon, he's a tough client, but he's ill-served by his lawyers. John Dean, terrible guy. Elliot Richardson, can't wait to sell him out. Len Garment, who's his former law partner. Len Garment is standing on the sidelines throwing rocks throughout Watergate. And then Buzhardt, and perhaps me, sell him out at the end because of a misunderstanding of the smoking gun tape. Okay? Now, let's go to the roadmap's enduring significance. I have 2 more minutes. This is the last slide. The difficulty with the roadmap is that it was decided because of the prosecutor's certainty of Nixon's criminal involvement. Sirica said you can't indict a sitting president. And he said you can't send anything to the Hill that contains opinions. You can send factual stuff, but not conclusions. So their creative solution was the roadmap. It's 55 pages. It's not been unsealed, but it's been described. And they say on this day, this happened. And then they footnote grand jury testimony. But they don't say, and therefore. It's just this happened. It didn't work. They thought they had clearly guided the House Judiciary Committee to the March 21st, the famous Cancer on the Presidency meeting with John Dean. But the guys, the staff at the House didn't get it, so that's why they had secret meetings where they went over it in inordinate detail. Well, what's happened recently, just last year, we're going to splash into current events. These three nationally prominent professors decided the roadmap was a perfect precedent for taking grand jury material on Donald Trump and moving it to the House Judiciary Committee where it could be used to impeach him. And they filed a petition to unseal, and I'd had a petition for a different reason. I want to see how, if there's a transcript of how Jaworski misled the grand jury. They just want the petition, the roadmap unsealed so they can say, see, this is a great precedent. I have a motion up there that says precedent, heck, it's no good at all. And these are the four weaknesses as precedent. It was the product of a corrupt bargain with Sirica. You let us send the roadmap, we'll bring the indictments in time for you to name yourself to preside over the trial. The sending of this was upheld on appeal. Sending of the roadmap is upheld on appeal, but the appellate court was tainted because the choice of the judges was tainted by a secret meeting. Neither Sirica's opinion nor the D.C. Court's opinion explicitly recognizes that the briefcase that goes with the roadmap contains 12 White House tapes. But they admit that in their report that comes out a year later. And they're trying to finesse this idea, the House can't demand the tapes because of separation of powers, so they just don't mention it. It's in there, but they don't mention it. And then finally, as it turns out, the White House itself never contested the roadmap. They used Haldeman and Mitchell, who were defendants, to contest it. But there's no actual clash between the White House and the special prosecutor. Now, those are fun things for lawyers, and those are fun things that have yet to develop. I mean, we're kind of going down that course, and this will come back up. That concludes my formal lecture. We now switch to Q&A, and you think that you get to ask questions, but you don't, not yet. We closed on the plumbers, and there was confusion of what on earth I was talking about. So I'm going to read you a summary, and then we'll go to questions. Apparently, I got so bogged down in details that my principal point about the plumbers was lost in the weeds. Here it is. It's the position of the executive branch that the president, as commander-in-chief, has the inherent authority to invade the private space of American citizens when national security is at risk. You can disagree. Legitimate debates can be had over just what constitutes a threat to our national security, but this was the position of every president, at least since Abraham Lincoln. Philip Hayman, a Harvard Law School professor, and the lady was over here who asked, I said, well, I skipped talking about Hayman. He's a Harvard Law School professor who'd worked with Archibald Cox in the Solicitor General's office during the Kennedy administration, strongly disagreed with this policy position. He was one of Cox's first two hires, and he used his position as Associate Special Prosecutor to shape the plumbers' prosecution in order to obtain a court ruling that rejected this idea that there is a national security defense to a Fourth Amendment violation. He found a willing judge in Gerhard Gesell who'd already ruled that way in Bud Krog's case. So that's why they had the secret contact to get Sirica to toss it to Gesell again, because they wanted that ruling again. Hayman returned from Harvard to argue the case against Bud and against Ehrlichman that there's no national security defense to a Fourth Amendment violation. You'll recall that Bill Merrill had asked Jaworski to urge Sirica to assign the Plumbers case to Gazelle precisely for this. In the end, Heyman's efforts to create a precedent weren't successful. But the whole purpose of pursuing the Plumbers prosecution, everybody involved in the Plumbers case has already been convicted of another crime except Ehrlichman, and he's going to be convicted of the Watergate cover-up. So whether you agree with Heyman's views or not, it seems clear if he had advocated them while the member of any administration, Republican or Democrat, the response would likely have been, "Thanks so much for sharing your views, Professor, but we have a war to fight and the security of the United States to protect. Why don't you just run along back home to your ivory tower at Harvard and write another law review article?" Because if he'd said under the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, as an official, we have to go challenge this assumption, they would have squished him like a bug. But because of this constitutional inversion of the creation of a special prosecutor, you got a professor on the outside who argues with the authority of the Department of Justice that this is not to be. Okay? So that's why the case was brought. And Bill Merrill's desire for personal glory. Then switch to Bud Krogh. Bud Krogh perjured himself, okay? When called before the grand jury to respond to questions about Liddy and Hunt's activities while on the White House staff, Krogh could have responded in one of three ways. He could have testified truthfully. That's what David Young did. He could have said, this was a national security operation. I'm not sure I can discuss it. He could have declined to answer on the same basis, or he could have lied, which is what John Dean urged him to do. Now, you have David Young and Bud being co-plumbers going in opposite directions. David has a full career, very successful career. Bud's never recovered. Now, you don't, take my word, don't lie to the grand jury. Okay, now, you've been given an assignment. You were given a 2-page memo, okay? Do you understand it? Somebody want to explain it to me? Okay? This almost got me fired. This is a fake. John Huntsman, who founded that great big chemical company, very, very wealthy, passed away, very generous to Wharton. He was staff secretary, and he was very officious. So a couple days before this, he puts out a 2-sentence memo that says Monday, whatever it is a federal holiday. Plan your schedules accordingly. Nobody knew what he meant. It was, it was Veterans Day or something like that. Memorial? No, it wasn't Memorial Day. No, look at the date. Was it? Okay. Okay.
May 28th.
Okay. So there was confusion. So next day he puts out a 2-paragraph memo saying, look, folks, you can have the day off, but you can't escape your responsibilities of responding if there's a problem. And he's trying to cover his tail with Haldeman. So if something goes wrong and we can't find the people, we didn't have cell phones, that Huntsman won't be blamed. Now, I happened to be at work that day because I was at work every day. And I made up this memo, okay? And you start reading it, and it divides the year into major federal holidays and less than major federal holidays. Remember Lucky Strike had this thing? Lucky Strike means fine tobacco, whatever the initials were. Well, LTMFH, less than major federal holidays. And the standards of what you're supposed to assume to do on major and minor. And where it really gets good is if you aren't going to use your secretary for at least 4 hours on a major federal holiday, you have to contribute her to a pool so people who are working can have proper secretarial staff. And you get yourself so involved. I mean, this is classic bureaucracy. And I made 25 copies of this memo, and I had a White House pass. I walked it around, and I put it on the desk of 25 people, including John Huntsman. I went from the old EOB over to the West Wing. I didn't go into Haldeman's office. And I didn't sign his name, I just listed his name. Well, the next day, the proverbial feces hit the fan because Haldeman said, they'll believe this. This will leak, and they'll think this is serious, and we will be mocked. find who did this. Off with their heads. Okay? And they assigned the Secret Service to come test the typewriters to find out who had done this, you know. And I'm terrified, you know, my budding career. Who would have protected Dick Nixon if I'd been fired? And I had to leave. I was so upset. Leave work that day. And they got down to a guy, more senior than I was. I mean, I was not senior. And he was a trickster. And he said, I didn't do it, but I know who did it, and I'm not telling you, and you, the Secret Service, have no right to be conducting this investigation. There's no national security at risk here, no threat to the president. And they backed off. They're about 2 offices away from my typewriter. But you got to enjoy. Go read over those. Months later, a federal holiday came up, and Peter Flanagan's top assistant takes aside somebody in the press office and says, you know, Peter's assigned me the responsibility for working this out, and I just can't figure out how it's going to work. And she said, maybe it's a joke. You know? Okay, now you get questions. All right, sir.
I'm just curious, why were these documents sealed for 50 years?
It turns out, I thought it was nefarious. It's standard congressional procedure. Irvin Committee, House Judiciary Committee. What we do in the grand juries, we seal it forever. We're going to discuss that. The Congress, in the same idea, if we looked into you and we didn't call you or cross-examine you in public, we have no right to publish adverse things we learned about you. So if it's not in the public hearings, it's sealed. Now, but they do it for all congressional investigations. It wasn't just for this. So 2024, hold your breath. I'll be here. I'll be here. I think the prosecutors fed questions to the Irvin Committee. I've told you, it's all theater. And that what you saw was all carefully orchestrated. And I think they told the House all kinds of grand jury information in secret that they couldn't have done. But it was a higher loyalty. You've heard the phrase. Sir.
So with the smoking gun, was Nixon not aware of what he was saying, or was he agreeing with something else entirely?
The question was Nixon's motivation on the smoking gun. I maintain that the president is asked to make those sorts of decisions, you know, here's what we'd like to do, 30 times a day. No big thing. Haldeman comes in, says, look, and I'll get you the quote, week 10. The FBI investigation is going in a direction we don't want it to go. How come Pat Gray can't control it? Well, he'd like to, but he can't. They're tracing the financing. They're tracing the money. They're going to get to these guys, Dahlberg and the other. And John Dean has come up with this idea to tell them, don't interview those 2 people. And then they talk about other stuff. And then Haldeman circles back, just like a good chief of staff. Now, you agree this is what we ought to do. And then they go do it. Well, when we restaffed, we lost the institutional memory of why that had happened. The contact of Ehrlichman and Haldeman with the CIA was publicly known, and nobody cared because it held up the interview of 2 people for 9 days, and when the prosecutors interviewed them, there was no criminality. So it was only when it turned out the president was involved that it took on new. But I don't think Nixon gave it 2 thoughts. He was worried about the disclosure of names of prominent Democratic donors. No big thing. These tapes, this tape machine is going to come back and bite you because, and we'll talk about this when we do week 10, it's not a full picture. It's a picture of what happened that day in that office. And all kinds of things are going on elsewhere that you don't know about or you have to factor in to fully understand. Sir.
Why was he worried about the expression of these two Democratic contributors, what would have happened if their names came out?
Well, we'll come to this, okay? But I will help you. The question was, why was Nixon and Haldeman and so concerned about these two names? One of the guys is the CEO of Archer Daniels ADM, Archer Daniels Midlands, one of the two largest agribusinesses in the world. And the CEO is very active politically. He was chairman of Hubert Humphrey's campaign against Nixon, named Duane Andreas. When Humphrey is named vice president, he has to put his assets into a blind trust. He has one trustee, it's Duane Andreas, okay? Duane is nobody's fool. Odds are Nixon's going to be reelected, so he's playing it both ways. And he gives him $25,000 under the express promise from the head of Nixon's finance committee that his name will never become public. Just get us the money before April 7th, before the new law comes into effect, and you'll be fully protected. Well, the FBI wants to interview the guy who picked up the cash in Andreas's condominium down in Florida. And the guy calls Maurice Stans, who's Nixon's head of finance, and says they're going to learn about Duane Andreas. Now, a lot of Democrats don't have a sense of humor. So after this all came out, they indicted him. They prosecuted him criminally under the allegation that 25 thou was really corporate and not personal. The other guy they prosecuted criminally was Big John Connolly. He's a Democrat who switched and became a Republican. Well, you don't mess with a special prosecutor. You know, they got long memories. So you've got politically motivated prosecutions, but the concern was the exposure of Andreas's name would become public and he'd be ruined. Other questions? Sir, wait, are there any more? He gets a twofer here. Okay, go ahead.
I noticed during all of this that Ford was never mentioned or a part of any of these discussions. Is that intentional, or he was not involved in it?
Well, Agnew is Veep to begin with. Right. No, Ford didn't want to be anywhere near Watergate, and we didn't want him anywhere near Watergate. And except for this one, you know, Jerry, you may want to think about what you might do if you're president in a week. You know, Jerry. No, there was no interest in getting the vice president, and nobody cared what he thought. You know, no. He wasn't there. He wasn't there for the break-in. He wasn't there for the stuff. Nixon thought a lot of Ford's political opinions, but not on Watergate. Ma'am.
To what degree, if any, do you believe this precedent setting of a special prosecutor was really the first firecracker to go off that would have been better not to be done? Did the special prosecutor basically muddy the waters?
Well, muddy the waters is the question was was the first mistake having a special prosecutor? Did that set the ball in motion? On the tapes during that critical week when the cover-up's coming down, they're talking about appointing a special prosecutor. They want this thing cleaned out. They don't think they're at risk. This is Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Nixon. He talks about, even in his speech, giving Richardson the authority to appoint a special supervising prosecutor. But Nixon's thinking of one guy. And then it gets caught up in politics, and the original budget is for 100 people. And they start investigating everything because the goal, you see it today, the goal is we got to find something on this guy. There's no special prosecutor for 50 years before. Go all the way back to Teapot Dome, and that was run by two guys. All right, we got 10 minutes, and your questions are slowing down. I'm going to show you something. This is the wire that comes in from Al Haig, who's in Egypt with the president, when Buzhardt has his heart attack, and this says, okay, Shepard's in charge. Okay? Yeah, I'm there. I count. Next week is the cover-up trial. Thank you.